Hi, everyone, and James and the digital. Thank you, James. And thank you to the Digital Commonwealth for having me. For those who don't know me, I am Elise Soucie-Watts. I'm the Executive Director at Global Digital Finance. We're a not-for-profit industry association. We work very closely with both the public and the private sector, aiming at fostering best practice, standard setting, and also a lot of feedback on the regulatory frameworks defining the future of digital finance. So what I wanted to talk to you guys about today is something that has been bothering me, weighing on my mind for a while, and I think especially in the current geopolitical climate. And don't worry, despite the fact that I am an American expat, I am not going to talk about tariffs, but I do want to talk about reciprocity. So what is reciprocity really? And the good kind, the kind that really matters. This is the practice of exchanging things with others for mutual benefit, especially privileges granted by one country or organization to another. And I think, as I said, in a world where we are seeing an increasing, fracturing on both the political level, economically, and technologically, reciprocity is really essential. And it is essential in particular for digital technologies to be able to grow and scale. But there is an inherent tension here that I think really needs to be acknowledged. There's a tension between these new technologies and between sovereignty and borders. New technologies are borderless by design. All of the wonderful things that we're going to talk about today and have already heard about this morning, from AI to DLT, stablecoins, tokenization, these all find their most pressing use case in being able to be cross-border and global. Yet, we instead see regulatory frameworks and also the actions of nations increasingly pulling inward. We see a lot of pushes for technological sovereignty, a term that maybe not first used, but first heavily used by the European Union. And we saw this fear, for example, of cloud is a great one, where they talk about technological sovereignty all the time. The EU does not wish to be reliant on American tech giants like AWS. They really want sovereign cloud. And this is why you see regulatory frameworks emerging that have really strong requirements for onshoring your capital, onshoring your staff, and onshoring your operations. That is a push to preserve borders, and it is not always an unwarranted one, especially given the fracturing and the tensions that we do see rising around the globe. But I think we do need to think about this here, because if the tech itself is designed to be global and used on a cross-border basis, but the rules are locally imposed, something has to give. Without some form of reciprocity, we risk a future where digital finance fragments before it even has a chance to truly scale to its full potential. And so again, I just want to emphasize here that reciprocity in this time and age matters more than ever. Digitization depends on this global scalability. And fragmented regulation isn't just something for us sort of policy wonks to think about in the back room and talk about how we need harmonization and these really technical and detailed rules. This has a material market impact. If we do not have some of these forms of reciprocity, it will lead to inefficiencies, duplication, and actually the loss of global market potential for many, many firms. And again, I want to remind everyone here, because I feel like reciprocity has been maybe a not so nice word the past couple of months. Reciprocity is not charity. It is mutual self-interest. And it should be and can be the growth strategy for digital markets. It is something that the public sector and the private sector should be thinking about and striving towards as part of that growth. The first movers in enabling that reciprocity with key partners in key jurisdictions will be the long-term winners in global markets. And this isn't something that is just theoretical. It is happening. And I promised I wouldn't talk about tariffs, but I do want to talk about a different piece of U.S. legislation that I think is really critical here, which is the Genius Act about stablecoins. Passed through the Senate, we also have the Stable Act in the House, headed towards reconciliation. There's a really important paragraph at the end of the Genius Act, a whole section, in fact, which focuses specifically on reciprocity for stablecoin arrangements. There are several provisions there that set out the reciprocity could be enabled for registered and regulated U.S. stablecoins with foreign jurisdictions, and this would be done at the jurisdiction level. It would be a decision taken by the federal government with other frameworks that they deem to be up to the appropriate standards. And of course, we also hear calls for this in other places as well. As James said earlier, I know many people are off on flights to Dubai this week, and a common refrain that I hear from firms that are moving there is, how can we make our licenses more useful? How can we grow and, have a home base in Dubai, but then also access markets in Saudi, Bahrain, and these other markets where there's deep capital and liquidity and a lot of interest from firms that are growing and moving there. We've done this in other parts of financial services, and we can do it for digital markets as well. There are bilateral treaties that are in place for the enforcement of judgments from a legal perspective across all areas of finance. We can also do this for digitization. And of course, I would be remiss to also not mention other areas where this is also happening. We have the African Union, and of course, the European Union, probably one of the best examples of where this reciprocity is happening, with passporting across 30 plus jurisdictions to support operational efficiency. And, you really do have to take a step back and think that, of course, one of the reasons why a lot of crypto and digital asset firms are going to get licensed in the EU is because they're one of the only regions with a completed regulatory framework, a topic for a very different keynote. But it is also because of that passporting across the markets. Firms would not be clamoring to go to the EU if you could only get licensed and serve the markets in France or Lithuania. It's because of the ability to access the totality of the market. And so again, here it's important to remember that reciprocity isn't theoretical. It is already becoming a competitive advantage. And we see this when we see firms, for example, at Paris Blockchain Week, you heard public statements from US, major firms like Circle, who said they were urging US lawmakers to think about how to align with MiCA for operational ease. Now, that is a really striking statement. US regulators don't particularly like being told that they should do things like the EU. But if you think about that operational cost that it imposes upon firms where you don't have reciprocity, this is why you're seeing the private sector call for this. So how can we drive this forward, and how can we make it happen? And, I'm not naive enough to think that this will be extremely easy or that it will happen overnight. But I think there are 3 principles that can help guide us as we think about moving towards reciprocity. And the first is alignment to global standards. Obviously, anyone who knows me well knows I probably couldn't have this talk without mentioning bodies like IOSCO, Financial Stability Board, FATF. While some might not always agree with those principles, they are the standard setters. And it's key that we have alignment from jurisdictions to the principles they set out. That is how we have that harmonization at the first level on a global basis. And again, it's not just thinking about those principles, but actually doing an assessment to see where countries fall. The Financial Stability Board conducted a peer review this year, and is going to be presented to the G20 at the end of the year. They also asked for input from the private sector. And that was all about seeing how various jurisdictions had actually managed to develop a crypto asset framework and also align with those principles. It's important that industry keeps engaging with efforts like that so we can really see where the gaps are. The second principle I think we should keep in mind is to build on existing regimes. So again, MiCA, the US framework when it gets here, Abu Dhabi actually is a pretty good framework, as does VARA in Dubai and the DFSA. We also have Hong Kong, for example, and Japan have had a framework for years. Thinking about jurisdictions where we already have examples of what works well, and then emerging jurisdictions who are still building those frameworks, really should seek to align to them. Of course, there's going to be regulatory competition, but don't go so different in the regulatory framework that firms are having to balance extremely different compliance costs across the various homes that they have. And then the third principle I think we should strive for is to embed direct industry feedback. And this is where it's really important for all of us in ways like the Digital Commonwealth, the feedback that we give to regulators bilaterally to really get involved. Because while regulators are thinking about this and where they can harmonize, it's down to us to tell them the specific areas where that harmonization needs to occur. What are the specific requirements that from a compliance perspective, if they are too far apart where we're going to have increased compliance costs, and what other areas can there be more flexibility where regimes actually can push to maybe have a bit more of a competitive regulatory advantage? And so here I would just say that Reciprocity is not going to be something that spontaneously occurs overnight. It is designed, tested, and iterated, and industry should be a part of that process alongside the public sector. And so, in closing, I would say that, again, this is something that is about progress, not about perfection. We're never going to have perfect equivalents for any type of regulation anywhere around the world. However, it does mean that we can secure these areas of mutual benefit. We can work towards faster growth, better stability, and stronger global markets. And I would argue that in a world that is increasingly fragmenting, the bold move here is to work towards reciprocity and connect so that we can scale digital markets together. Thank you very much.